The Amazon Prime Lord of the Rings TV series is in production. The setting of this show has been confirmed to take place in the Second Age of J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth. It was also recently confirmed that the characters of Sauron, Elrond, and Galadriel will be making appearances. This has led many to believe that one of the main storylines that we might see in this upcoming series will be the creation of the famed Rings of Power. In this video, I'd like to talk about the forging of these rings, as well as what they do for the beings that wear them. Around the year 1200 of the Second Age, Sauron came out of hiding, taking on a fair form and disguising himself as an emissary from the Valar, named AranAire. His intention was to corrupt the elves, who were some of the more powerful beings in Middle-earth. He planned to accomplish this through his forging of the One Ring, which would control all other rings. While Sauron, under the guise of AranAire, was not successful in gaining access to the Elven Kingdom in Lindon, where Gil-galad and Elrond resided, he was able to gain entry into Eregion. This is where he taught the elven smiths how to craft special rings which would grant the elves who wore them certain powers. At first, the Noldorin smiths created lesser rings, which served as a practice of sorts for them. In the year 1500 of the Second Age was when the greater 16 Rings of Power were created. For those who are familiar with the history of Middle-earth, these eventually came to be the 9 that were given to men, and the 7 that were given to the Dwarf Lords. When AranAire departed from Eregion, Celebrimbor went on to forge the 3 greatest rings using the knowledge that he had gained. He finished these rings around the year 1590. Their names were Narya, the Ring of Fire, Nenya, the Ring of Water, and Gwillieth, the Ring of Air. Just 10 years later, Sauron finished making the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom, putting a great part of his power into it. With this ring, he sought to bring all the other rings of power and their wearers under his influence. Whoever mastered the One also had control over the works performed by the other ring-bearers, and could perceive and even control their thoughts. Upon Sauron's creation of the One, the elves heard him speak the now famous spell that had been inscribed on it, and realized that they had been betrayed. This prompted them to take off and hide their rings, which infuriated the Dark Lord, who then came against the elves with open war and demanded that the rings be given to him. The elves were successful in preventing Sauron from attaining their 3 great rings, but throughout the war he was able to recover the other 16. Having failed to bring the mighty elves under his control, he then distributed the rings he had reclaimed to dwarves and men. Interestingly, Sauron was unable to force the dwarven ring-bearers to submit to his will because of their natural hardiness and resistance to domination. However, the rings did cause them to have an increased lust for gold, which contributed to a rise in infighting and quarreling between them. They ended up using their rings to build treasure troves, which drew many opponents and mighty dragons. Ultimately, the increased greed that was caused by these rings led to each wielder's ruin. The other 9 rings were divided amongst evil-hearted men who became sorcerers and kings and saw their abilities increase. One feature of the Rings of Power was that any mortal who wore them was granted a lifespan far beyond their natural one. This is likely an unintended side effect, as Sauron originally purposed for these rings to be worn by elves who themselves were already immortal. As such, any mortal individual who kept a Ring of Power would not obtain more natural life. Instead, they would continue existing until living became unbearable. This is something that Bilbo hinted at toward the end of his time in possession of the One Ring, by stating that he was beginning to feel thin and stretched. This was no doubt a sign that this process was beginning to affect him. The One Ring, along with the 7 and the 9, all had the ability to tap into the unseen to different degrees. However, the One could completely shift the wearer to the spirit world, rendering the material body invisible to mortals. The 9 and the 7 rings were so strongly under Sauron's control that they could cause the wearer, especially men, to fade and turn into a wraith under Sauron's domination, which is what ultimately happened as the men who received the 9 eventually faded away to become the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths. They became little more than extensions of Sauron's will, who existed only to do his bidding. In the Silmarillion, it is indicated that the 7 rings of the Dwarves were not fundamentally different from the 9 that were given to men. In the Unfinished Tales, it is mentioned that the 7 were created before the 9. Sauron helped to create both sets, so it is likely that their powers and effects on their wearers were similar. The 3 greater rings that were created by Celebrimbor were fundamentally different from all the others, because these rings were made for specific purposes that were not in harmony with Sauron's line of thought. It is presumed that Sauron wasn't even aware of their creation until after the fact. These rings were not created as weapons of war or as a means to dominate others. Instead, their purpose was to aid in healing, resisting evil, and to be used in the preservation of the domains of their elven wearers. However, they were still linked to the One Ring, making the thoughts of the wearer visible to the wielder of the One. Narya, also named the Ring of Fire, or Red Ring, was worn first by the Elven King Gil-galad, and according to the Unfinished Tales, at the start of the War of the Elves and Sauron, Celebrimbor gave Narya to Círdan, who kept it after Gil-galad's death at the end of the Second Age. In the Third Age, after Círdan recognized Gandalf's true nature as one of the Maiar from Valinor, he gave him the ring. Narya is described as having the power to inspire others to resist tyranny, domination, and despair, as well as giving the wielder resistance to the wariness of time. It was certainly a wise choice on the part of Círdan to give this ring to Gandalf, who would ultimately play a vital role in gathering together and helping the forces of men to unite and rise up against the forces of Sauron. Nenya, also named the Ring of Water, the White Ring, and the Ring of Adamant, is wielded by Galadriel of Lothlorien. It is described as being made of mithril and is set with a white stone, which is presumably a diamond. This ring is said to possess a radiance that matched that of the stars. Nenya's power was preservation, protection, and possibly concealment from evil. Because of Nenya, it was said that Lothlorien would not have fallen unless Sauron had personally attacked it. Galadriel used the powers of Nenya to create and sustain Lothlorien, but it also increased her longing for the sea and her desire to return to the Undying Lands. After Sauron was defeated with the destruction of the One Ring, Nenya's power faded along with the other rings of power. After Galadriel sailed into the west bearing this ring, the magic and beauty of Lorien faded, and it was gradually depopulated. Vilya, also named the Ring of Air, the Blue Ring, the Dominant Ring, or Ring of Sapphire, is the greatest of the 3 rings. When Sauron attacked Eregion, Narya and Vilya were sent to the Elven King Gil-galad in Lindon, where it was later given to Elrond, who bore it through the later years of the Second Age and all of the Third. Vilya contained a great blue stone which was set in a gold band. This contributed to its titles as the Ring of Sapphire and the Blue Ring. The exact power of Vilya is not mentioned, but it is reasonable to assume that it also possessed the power to heal and to preserve, as it is mentioned in the Silmarillion that Celebrimbor had forged these rings for those purposes. There is some speculation that Vilya also granted the ability to control minor elements. This is primarily because of the event where Elrond had summoned a torrent of water as the Nazgul attempted to invade Rivendell. The ring could have also possessed the power to see into the future, as Elrond had the gift of foresight. However, these powers may simply have been natural gifts of his. Upon Sauron's destruction, the power of Vilya also faded, and it was taken by Elrond over the sea to the Undying Lands at the end of the Third Age. The lore behind the Rings of Power is one of the more fascinating elements of Tolkien's writings, and the Second Age presents a marvelous opportunity to flesh out many storylines involving them. The Tolkien estate has insisted that Amazon stay within the main shape of the events that make up the Second Age, and they hold veto power on any story decision to ensure that this condition is met. That being said, there is quite a bit of room to tell some interesting stories involving the bearers of the 19 Rings of Power, as well as the forging of the One Ring itself. Of course, as is the case with any film project that is being adapted from well-known source material, it will be challenging to craft a story that stays true to the source, but also allows for relative freedom and creativity on the part of the writing staff. However, if the proper care is taken, a story centered around the events involving the Rings of Power could greatly contribute to the success and longevity of Amazon's upcoming series. But let me know what you think of the idea of seeing the crafting and war over the Rings of Power play out in this upcoming series. Do you think Amazon would be able to handle this in a satisfying way? Or are there other stories you'd rather see adapted from the Second Age? Let me know in the comments section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and be sure to subscribe for more Lord of the Rings and other sci-fi and fantasy content. Thank you all so much for your support, and as always, have a very nerdy day.